Our next speaker is Stella Smith. She is a musicologist and emerging museum professional from Washington, D.C. She holds an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University and a postgraduate certificate in Nazi-era Art Provenance Research from the University of Denver's Center for Art Collection Ethics. Concentrating on dilemmas of 20th century instrument provenance, she has held curatorial internships at several national and international museums, including the Musikmuseum in Basel and the United States Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Stella Smith.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the Gribbon Award Committee for generously funding this research last year with a grant. Really propelled the paper. Very grateful. So a few shifts into my curatorial internship at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC 2020 to 2021. My mentor, the musicologist and Yiddish historian Brett Werb, received this picture in an email from a man outside Chicago. The ask was whether the museum would be interested in acquiring this heirloom of a large Roma family who immigrated shortly after the war. He relayed that his father had played it during his days as an itinerant musician around the bars of Chicago in the 1960s. He could not trace its use back any further, but was certain it must have been played during the war due to its intricate marquetry and Jewish star. Since then, Brett has received a handful more pieces of correspondence from individuals looking to get appraisals for or learn the history of their Holocaust violins. Each party has described and usually included pictures of six-pointed star-shaped mother-of-pearl inlays as decorations on the back plates. One of the violins we received had 4 8-pointed stars on the front plate in each corner. One had been found in the attic of a newly purchased house, one at an estate sale in Pennsylvania, and one at a yard sale in Sweden. When the acquisition of this violin was not pursued, it went up on eBay, and it's still there. The auction ends tomorrow morning. If you're interested, you can throw your hat in the ring. Journalist and colleague Dina Gold has recently written an article for the Times of Israel on the rise of the Holocaust violin auctions on eBay, such as this one and this one. So Brett had never seen or heard of evidence that these decorated violins had ever been played by klezmers in Europe. In fact, he relayed he found it counterproductive, if not illogical, for European Jews around the turn of the century to have branded their instruments with the symbol of their persecution, especially through the Holocaust. But it's hard to say for sure. None of the instruments that we hold at the Holocaust Museum have any inlay or decoration on them. So I inventoried the hundreds of photographs we have of violinists held at the museum, searching for one of these fiddles in the grainy monochrome scenes of pre-war life, in internment camps and partisan outposts. So finding nothing, did the same at the Musée de la Shoah in Paris, nothing. Same at Yad Vashem, produced no evidence of hexagram violins in use historically. World-renowned klezmer expert Walter Zev Feldman, when asked about these violins, was surprised at the suggested association, saying that he'd never heard of such decorations on violins played by klezmerim anywhere at any point. James Loeffler, also, he's a professor at UVA. He specializes in Jewish history and musicology. Also shared in the surprise and confirmed that in his extensive study of modern klezmer practice, he has never seen a violin with a Star of David. Then on the instrument side, Bruce Babbitt, Arian Sheets, William Weishart, Larry Cavalieri, David Schoenbaum each reported they'd never seen fancy inlay violins with religious symbols. They were usually, florid embellishments or geometric patterns, or sometimes painted patriotic iconography for the ones that were marketed stateside, such as that middle one up there. And in that picture, all the way up top on its sideways incline, you can see a hexagram violin in the pile. Our session chair, Matt Zeller, though, has a good bit of experience working with fancy violins from his time between Charlotte and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, home of the Moravian settlement communities. And when inlaid stars came to his shop, they were considered Moravian stars, sort of an interpretation of the Star of Bethlehem. We'll revisit this a little bit later. First, for the uninitiated and the sleepy, fancy violins were an ornamented variety of mass-produced export-aimed violins from the Musikwinkel, or music corner. It was a cluster of towns in Saxony, Germany. sort of within a smaller region of the Vogtland that bordered Bohemia. It's going to be that red dot right there that we're talking about. Business boomed during the Industrial Revolution, and so to up production, luthiers shifted from making entire instruments to specializing in just one part of them, like fingerboard or tailpiece. Master luthiers would then put whole instruments together by purchasing pre-made schachtels, or boxes, with the back, neck, ribs, and top to customize themselves. Bohemian craftspeople right over the border would then carry the schachtel kits that they'd make from their cottage industry villages to the Markneukirchen luthiers. This allowed violins to be quickly and cheaply produced to meet the hungry international market for Musikwinkel instruments. By the turn of the 20th century, the Musikwinkel had a market share of about 50% of worldwide stringed instrument manufacture, and Markneukirchen boasted the most millionaires per capita in the country. From 1893 to 1916, there was even a US consulate in Markneukirchen to facilitate the enormous volume of instruments traveling from Saxony to America. So throughout the 19th and then earliest 20th centuries, most American amateur and student musicians were playing on Markneukirchen violins. New middle-class money meant that hobbies such as domestic music making were socially favorable, if not obligatory, for a large swath of the population, which was hungrily looking through Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs for their next mail-order instrument. The presence of the US consulate in Markneukirchen almost exactly overlapped with the manufacture and advertisement of fancy violins to international consumers around 1880 to 1920. The best qualities of instruments from this inlaid subset are generally limited to their visuals, not always their tone. Any luthier you pick up off the street will tell you that any nick and divot you make in the body of a violin will alter its resonant quality significantly, not to mention the effects of the chips of the mother of pearl squished into the dense mastic. That being said, some of them can sound quite nice, and depending on the instrument, today they can go anywhere from $200 to $1,500. An article from the May 1921 edition of Etude magazine responds to a letter from a reader asking if their eye-catchy fancy violin holds any value. The magazine responds to the top left, good violinists will not have them. If a symphony violinist should bring such a violin to the orchestra, the rest of the violinists would no doubt indignantly chase him out. I would love to see that. A catalog description of a hexagram violin is then listed for those readers unfamiliar with inlaid strings. You see neat pearl design with a pearl star center inlaying on back, etc. The editor describes on the right how the fancy gingerbread work usually cost $4 pre-war for a reason, as they were factory fiddles. And, paraphrasing the quote, in a post-World War I catalog listed by an American house a few months ago, not a single violin with fancy inlaying is listed. They say this shows that the demand for such violins is dying out. There was demand for them some years ago, chiefly in rural districts, but as the public is becoming more educated on the violin question, they are not so much wanted now. So Etude's reports concerning average prices and declining popularity generally match what I was able to find in surviving catalogs, but it's been much easier to find post-World War I catalogs than pre, so the prices I saw did generally skew a good bit higher. That's also if I found any catalogs at all. They are really few and far between. Fragile paper, not meant to last, but bear with me. Here begins the survey of what I could find. If there's going to be any attribution of inherent religious meaning to these inlays on the Markneukirchen fiddles, it's certainly going to be of use to know the ways in which the designs were conceived and marketed. Okay, we're hopping back over to the Musikwinkel for just a minute. At the Musical Instrument Museum of Markneukirchen, historian Enrico Weller maintains an extensive collection of Musikwinkel trade catalogs published for both domestic, wholesale, and international export. On the left, in this catalog from the workshop of Ernst Doling in 1900, Enrico found a hexagram flanked by 2 octograms above and below. Max Adler of Ellerbach on the right was selling the same violin 20 years later in a catalog written in German, English, Italian, and French, a testament to the international export practices of the region. A 1912 catalog by Vinokurov and Sinitsky shows likewise that the Russian market also had their hexagram violin advertised, with no religious descriptors and alongside other non-religious inlays. But the most interesting primary source puzzle piece is going to come from a ledger from Markneukirchen maker Theodor Stark. It's a little hard to read. You Leipzigers help me out if you can, but it's clear that it calls the sketch of the center inlay a double goldfish star with 2 stars floor and ceiling around them. So there's no mention here of Star of David connotations or even any intention to evade them in marketing materials. And the term goldfish here probably refers to the pearl or shell from top shelf abalone, the things reserved for expensive pieces. The mother of pearl, the shards that you've been seeing squished into mastic, that's generally going to come from the lining of oysters or mollusks. Also, if you've ever wondered where the term, or why the term mother is used in this case, they think it's likely an obsolete term for the dregs or leftovers of something, because you'd scrape it out from the shell. So these have been the source side catalogs, and they don't necessarily represent how the hexagrams were marketed stateside. These days, the American Midwest is where the majority of these violins seem to be popping up, judging from the solicitations received by the Holocaust Museum, as well as tracking the locales of where online auction listings pop up. I've been watching for the past 2 years or so, so that's where I'm getting that. So then the primary question becomes, how are they advertised in their counterpart American importing catalogs? We're thinking about Sears, Wurlitzer, Lyon and Healy. I looked, exhaustively through Library of Congress, New York Public Library, the Smithsonian Archives, the Cincinnati Library. I reached out to all the strings experts from the major American auction houses to see if they kept any catalog records. It's understandably no, not really within the price range. I spent a few days combing through Claire Given's private catalog collection in Minneapolis. Bruce Babbitt also kindly went through his own archive to try to see if he could see any stars. The National Musikmuseum had one catalog from 1 year. It's an 1893 Paul Stark issue from the Markneukirchen side, so didn't include it here because it is not American, but it had a hexagram inlay that I'd never seen before. It's hilariously blurry, which is why I didn't include it. You'd hurt your eyes, but hopefully when a better scan shows up, we'll be able to see whether the description calls it a Star of David. It's very unlikely that it does, though. The only illustration of a hexagram in an American catalog so far has been in this 1898 Wurlitzer catalog shown here. It's from Roy Earhart's Trade Catalog, Identification and Price Compendium. So you see 2 hexagrams flanking an iron cross, which was a symbol of first Prussian, then German military medals later. And then the Nazi Party, of course, 3 decades later would insert a swastika into the middle of the Iron Cross to add to the history of its use. Today, the Iron Cross represents the Bundeswehr, the German military. And, first thought, it seems illogical that a Markneukirchen maker would intentionally flank an emblem of German pride with the icon of a religion of which its citizens were growing increasingly intolerant at the time. Besides this one, no other 6-point star illustrations have surfaced. And then here's where a really unhelpful incongruity lies in between the German records and the American ones. The catalogs on the German side have illustrations, they just don't have descriptions. And then we have the opposite problem on the American side. So I'll share just a bit of the descriptions and general trends of American marketed fancy inlay sections if you've ever been so curious. So Wurlitzer, Ditzen, and Sontag are going to be the catalogs that I briefly mentioned. They're the distributors so far that have been found in catalogs to have been selling hexagram inlays. So Wurlitzer, who, just like instruments he imported decades later, had left the Musikwinkel for New Jersey in 1853 and advertised a hexagram fiddle from his hometown in his catalogs from 1880 till 1911. So there were 4 8-pointed stars on the front plate with 1 star, likely 6 points on the back. This is the most common version that comes up to auction or, solicitation. Ditzen sold one in 1909. So both Wurlitzer and Ditzen charged $6 for the model. That would hover around $200 today in US dollars. In 1883, Sontag's most expensive fancy violin had a hexagram. It was just over $18. That's like a little more than $500 today, when his inlaid prices usually averaged about half of that. However, you can see on the right before the turn of the century, the company had significantly dropped its prices, its number of inlaid offerings, as well as the word inlaid from its section head. Lyon and Healy came through with some interesting proto-star inlays. 1882 on the left, number 58, violin with this flower star shape was the most expensive inlay you could order, coming in at $1875, that's like $530 today. Number 58 remained in the catalog until exactly 20 years later when it got the redesign seen on the right. The rings of this star inlay are much closer to what manufacturers seem to have decided on for star inlays at that point. An August Pullman catalog from 1881 imported this Star of Bethlehem-looking inlay for $21 with the description, fine goldfish pearl inlaid, landscapes, portrait, etc. Again, that goldfish pearl used here is going to be the reason for that price that's, more than double the average. And then a handful of stray hexagrams popped up during the digging. That bridge up top, Wurlitzer Aubert model from 1931, it's got a hexagram, but it's likely a marker of 6 points of quality, as of course it was a symbol of neither business. I haven't been able to find another example of that. It might have just been a one-off. Famous Markneukirchen luthier Heberlein had two adjoined musical triangles form a hexagram at the top of his 1912 catalog. Heberlein was not Jewish. And then the charming inlaid tailpiece is owned by Claire Givens and Andrew Dipper in Minneapolis. On the right, you're going to see a relevant strike from the strings talk. It's harmonica and accordion maker Armin Liebman, who was from Gera, which is not too far from the Musikvinkel at all. He was a Protestant and decided that this would be his symbol. I want to get a drink with that accordion player. He looks jaunty. Thank you for laughing. In 1897, the Zionist Congress of Basel adopted the Star of David as its emblem and eventual centerpiece of the flag of the State of Israel. But before the 19th century, the hexagram was a widely diffused symbol used by Jewish communities, breweries, schools of alchemy, churches, mosques, charities, heraldry, vexillology, you name it. The blue doors that you see on the left, and I sort of cut out, one of the center inlays. Those are the doors on St. Nikolai's Lutheran Church in Markneukirchen, built in 1842. The Star of David was first officialized as a Jewish symbol, according to record, in the mid-14th century when Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV granted the Jews of Prague the right to carry a flag, and they chose the star as their symbol. 4 years after the end of World War II, German-born Israeli philosopher and historian of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, Scene Center, penned an equally subversive and extensive history of the Star of David, describing that official process of adoption in Basel in 1897, not so much based on an intrinsic widespread use of Jewish identification in contrast, say, to that of the menorah. Rather, the selection was based on two merits. One, as it was, as discussed, a common decorative motif, and two, it did not explicitly carry a religious association at the time in the consciousnesses of their contemporaries. This lack, it's argued by Scholem, became its virtue. The symbol didn't arouse memories of the past, it held hope for the future. As for the subsequent branding work done by the Nazi Party that cemented the star as a representation of Jewish persecution in the modern mind, Scholem says, if there be such a thing as a soil that grows meaning for symbols, this is it. His account of the shifting marriage of convenience regarding the symbol's contemporary sacredness is sometimes contested by modern scholars of Jewish thought, but either way, I'm sharing it to emphasize that all things considered, we today carry a substantially different collective understanding of the symbol than the general population did prior to World War II. And it's clear that by the cusp of the 20th century, the Markneukirchen distributors were using the hexagram as a general ornament and not a Star of David. The Musical Instrument Museum of Markneukirchen has no record of any Jewish distributors. We've also seen how hexagrams almost always appear around other stars of 4 or 8 points, and even an iron cross. There were no Christian cross inlays marketed as far as the catalogs reveal, and neither were there any other religious symbols. Double Maltese crosses were popular designs, very popular, but again, not religious. But the notion that the stars are considered to be Moravian around communities on the East Coast, where the Moravians migrated, is an interesting one. And apologies for not having a picture of a Moravian star. Picture a 3D 26-pointed star. See how many points you can generate in your mind. They historically sometimes just carried 6 or 8 points, though. The Moravian star is considered to have been created in Saxony in the 1830s by immigrants from that region who traveled through Bohemia to settle in the German state. And you see we're still sort of staying in the same triangle here. It's thought that Moravian use of the star during the Advent season led to general German adoption of the decoration during Christmas time. And in that sense, when thinking about the Bohemian craftspeople making those starred backplates to order, and then combined with the fact that stars varied so frequently in point count, if there were any religious roots to the star, they might have been Protestant. But even so, just like in the case of the Star of David, they were not marketed as such and were probably just pretty stars. So what can we glean from the catalogs? Not only is it that the valuable real estate on the pages was reserved for the fanciest of fancy inlays and their illustrations, it's also that these violins were already at the cheapest spectrum of what was available to consumers at the time. But even so, it's clear that the hexagram inlays were infrequently put on the market by American importers, but it's not immediately clear why. The inlays generally used flourished scrolls, ovals, things were curly and leaf-like. There weren't that many at all that were geometric or angular, especially post-1900. From the records in Markneukirchen, catalogs were still selling inlaid violins well into the 1920s in Europe. But in contrast, the inlaid section stateside, like Etude magazine theorized, had quickly dwindled in number by the start of World War I, if not earlier. But regardless of whether it was a decline in popularity suffered by the violins in the States, or whether it was positive favor comparatively enjoyed by them in Europe, the Musikmuseum took the hit of the First World War hard. And it could be by the time that trade resumed in the mid-19-teens, when it came to the logistics of shipping and prices to send instruments over, American dealers just did not want to pay to transport the lower end of the quality spectrum that was already declining in popularity. And if it turns out that the disparity lies more in trends of like post-war consumer culture or musical aesthetics, that's above my pay grade at the moment. Back to just the hexagrams and what they can mean and not mean, because this is where the useful, devil's advocate work is going to start. So, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is entirely possible that a Jewish violinist, browsing the catalogs with a few bucks to spare, could order a hexagram violin because they identified with the symbol, or because they were just fond of the design. And if they were a klezmer, would that make that a klezmer instrument? Our semiotics really only belong to us at the time that we're around. It's context of culture, it's context of time, and symbols morph in meaning swiftly and constantly, both individually and for the society. Take red baseball caps, for example. It can be really swift. That was instant. And if a klezmer were to imbue the violin with klezmer style and intention, then that would become an inextricable aspect of its provenance. But without a verified provenance narrative that includes Jewish ownership, it is impossible to say that a violin with a hexagram was ever near klezmerism, let alone occupied Europe or the Holocaust. And why are we interested in misunderstandings of the public? It's because it is impacting both the market and museums. It's warping public history, and I would really, consider it an issue for the organological community when someone posts to an antiques identification Facebook group with a hexagram violin they found at a yard sale, and no fewer than 50 comments flood in about the wonderful Holocaust artifact that they've discovered. So let's talk about it. I'm happy to answer any questions, both here or wherever, but if you have experience with fancy violins or have been approached with similar questions at your institutions, I'd love to hear about your perspectives on the issue. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Do you know the work of Carla Chapreau?
An incredibly supportive mentor.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, she's fantastic.
Other questions? We've got about 5 minutes here. All right, Jason over there.
Do you know of any of these in institutional collections?
No, I have not found one. And thank you everybody for sticking around so long. It's lovely.
Thanks so much for your paper, Stella.
Hey.
I'm curious to know how much labor these inlays required. I'm just trying to, I was wondering, like, why would somebody buy a cheap violin with inlay? Like, was it a way for companies to kind of up the price on what would have been otherwise like a mass-produced factory instrument? And if they were for kind of the visual aesthetic of the instrument, then why are some of the inlays, or most of the inlays, on the back of the instrument? I'm just curious about placement and how much work it took to make them.
That's a great question. In terms of, so second part, the only instruments I've really seen inlays on the front of, like, you know, of the catalog pages I showed with lots of different inlays, they didn't have them on the front. The only ones that had them on the front had stars, and they were usually 8 points or 4 points. As for the price brackets, it is sort of a funny contradiction that these, well, the labor that these required to make these inlays was a different type of labor that it requires to make a violin well. Is it correct to say that?
Yeah.
And
probably had a different craftsman doing the work. You probably had
that's another part too.
That specialized in doing this inlay that was after the violin had been made.
Because it's much easier to carve out a 6-pointed star and then, you know, do some mastic and then grab some shells from a box and put it in, and then, you know, you mark it as done and move on to the next one. Easier to do that than it is to, you know, really skillfully carve the front plate of a violin, I'm guessing. Yeah, it's funny. So the labor that they took for their price point, it seems a little incongruous, but I think that is why. These usually ran about $5 to $15, where in other pages of the catalog, fancy inlay sections were always the final section. The ones that they pushed first were good student quality kits, you know, anywhere from like $50 to $100 at the time, and these were the fancily decorated cookies that look beautiful, and you want to get one because you're hungry, but then, yeah.
Stella, this is Jamie, way up at the top. Thank you for this fabulous paper. I'm thinking, and this might be completely illogical, but at the same time, you know, sheet music covers were highly ornate and were often used as kind of decorative art, you know, in a home. And so I could see this being hung on a wall backwards. But I mean, obviously without photographic evidence, it's only a guess.
It is. In terms of violins hanging on walls, I have heard from people like Brett and klezmer specialists that I've talked to that it was common to have violins hanging on walls in Jewish households. A violin that I've done a ton of provenance research on hung on a family wall for like 30 years until it was, I don't know, discarded and then ended up in a locked storage locker in Fresno, California. Yeah, I think that's a lot of the appeal to it. You know, they can sound good, but also it's you have company over and you're learning how to play the violin, and you just got this fantastic, violin that has an American eagle on the back. You know, do you guys want to see it? You want to hear how it sounds? I think there is a lot of that domestic culture work at play with the marketing of these as well.
And can I just jump in really quick? I think, just to play the devil's advocate, when you see marks on an instrument that is being hung on the wall, it's usually the back. So, because you have the fingerboard and the bridge on the front. So if you hang it on the wall, you usually put the back towards the wall. So yes, but no.
We have one more question up front. This will be the last question.
I was just, as you were talking about prices, I was thinking what we need to know is the percentage that it increased. You know, these are cheaper violins. Mm-hmm. I guess the point would be, what kind of a percent, it sounds like it's a fairly low percentage of increase to make something that looks really good. And that would be a draw to manufacturers because they could do this fairly cheaply. But I wasn't sure, I couldn't keep track of your prices back and forth.
It's okay, I didn't want to overwhelm everybody with like small numbers of dollars that were hard to keep track of. Yeah, I'm watching time. No, it's a good question. Right after World War I, they sort of jumped in price a little bit. They'd go up to like $8 to $11, and then pretty much, like Etude magazine said, like totally faded. So I don't know if it was sort of, I don't want to call it a bait and switch, but like, beautiful looking violins in a catalog, and then a lot of Americans order them, play them, maybe they get, a reputation like the orchestra recalled, and then everybody sort of, wash their hands of them. But they're still lovely, heirloom fiddles, and that is 0000.
All right. Well, thank you, Stella.